Welcome viewers to this session. In this session we will start with the Nyaya philosophy, which is another system of Indian philosophy. Nyaya philosophy or Nyaya system comes under the orthodox system, that means it accepts the authorities of Veda. Nyaya system is the first class we will be discussing. So before discussing Nyaya Epistemology, Nyaya Metaphysics or Nyaya Ethics, first we should know that a little background of Nyaya system, because as I said in the first class, the introduction to Indian philosophy, I said that no such system developed overnight. Then a Nyaya system as it such also takes its a time to develop. There are many scholars contribute their theory, their opinion and also some commentaries on others' theory. As a result, the Nyaya philosophy developed. So it took a long time the theory to be developed. At the last, many people also worked on the Nyaya philosophy, and their work, if you examine, you find that it is a completely different from the Nyaya philosophy in the ancient time, what they said. So there are differences you find both in logically as well as through argumentative or through commentary ways. All these differences you find. Henceforth, people say that there are two kinds of Nyaya. The earlier Nyaya is known as Prachina Nyaya or old Nyaya, then the new Nyaya is known as Navya Nyaya. Ganges, the scholar of Nyaya philosophy, written Tattva Chittamani. This is the starting point of Navya Nyaya philosophy. He criticizes many of the issues developed by the Nyaya philosopher in the old time or ancient time, and also he has given very new opinion on the Nyaya Sutras or the Nyaya text. That means whatever they have understood on some of the issues in the earlier time is totally or differently written by the Ganges, the Nyaya scholar, in his Tattva Chintamani. Therefore, they said that we find there are two types of Nyaya. One is old Nyaya, is known as Prachina Nyaya. The another is Navya Nyaya or the say new Nyaya. Okay. So before starting, we should know the historical background. First, the person named Gautam. Gautam is a sage, has written Nyaya Sutra, and people believe that it is the Gautam who is the founder of Nyaya school. Nyaya school believe in a realistic standpoint. Therefore, Nyaya philosophy is known as realism. That means anything that you see in this world, anything that can be seen in this world, can be perceived in this world or can be known through our sense experience, those exist in this world. And since they exist in this world, Nyaya philosophy says that we deal with those existences which are found in this phenomenal world. In this sense, Nyayas are known as realist, because whatever they speak, whatever they express about anything, the anything is related to the phenomenal world or the objects or events or state of affairs of the phenomenal world. So in this sense, Nyaya philosophers are realist philosophers. They are the true believer or prescriber of realism. Now let us see what are the historical background and how Nyaya philosophy developed. The Nyaya school is founded by Gautama, as I said, and Gautama is also named as Akhyapada. He is also known as Akhyapada. He has written the text, the Nyaya Sutra. Therefore, people believe that it is the Gautama who is the founder of this school. Nyaya means it is a true judgment or correct judgment. In an ordinary way, if it is be spoken, then it will be expressed in this way. Nyaya means correct thinking with proper argument and valid reasoning. That means Nyaya says that whenever you think in a very correct way. You think about an object that finds in the world, you should think also in a correct way. Therefore, the conclusion that you will derive from your thinking, it will be a valid one. So if you do not think about any event correctly, how can you reach to the conclusion and claim that that is a valid one? Therefore, they believe that our thoughts should be also correct. Therefore, we can have a valid reasoning and also we can establish the conclusion based on our previous experiences. Whatever you see in this world, you know that objects in this world, whatever you see in this world and you know all the objects in this world, if you know it very clearly, you know all the features of these objects, then you prescribe the theory of realism and your thought will be a valid one. Further they say Nyaya philosophy is known as Tarka Shastra because they do not believe anything as such without a science of reasoning. So Tarka Shastra stands for the science of reasoning. Then further they said that the Nyaya philosophy or Nyaya system is known as Pramana Shastra. Nyaya system very clearly said that we know many things in this world and there are sources of knowledge. Whatever we know, the objects in this world are not always valid because they prescribe there are 4 valid sources of knowledge. These are known as Pramana and these are identified as perception or Pratyakya, inference or Anumana, comparison or Upamana, and the last one is valid testimony or Sabda. Therefore they said that if the source of knowledge is correct, the knowledge that you attain from this source will be a valid knowledge. Therefore Nyaya philosophy is known as also Pramana Shastra. Further they said that Nyaya philosophy can also be regarded as Hetu Vidya. That means for them every event has a cause. If you can identify an object, there is a science involved in it to identify that object. Therefore they say that any argument you give, there should be a science behind this. There should be a logical thought and the logical thought should be correct for establishing some fact or for identifying an object. In this context they said that they are the prescriber of Hetu Vidya. Further they said Bada Vidya, Nyaya philosophy is known as Bada Vidya. That means the science of debate. What they mean is that anything to be accepted, anything to be validated, it is through the argument, and argument through the correct thinking or a logical sequence or the valid argument. If something cannot be argued properly, something cannot be established just like that, therefore they do not believe anything as it such comes to their way. Therefore they said that if at all you convince me, I need to convince what you are saying and I will accept that as true only when you argue it properly, only when you can able to answer my questions on that issue. Therefore they said that it is because of the argument we reach to a conclusion where you say that this is a valid argument. Therefore the object has to be identified or the fact has to be established or the argument has to be valid. Further they said that whatever we will argue with the critical mind or anything that we will be developing through the critical study. That means a particular event or a particular object, when they are putting their opinion on that or try to explain that object, they are considering different peripheral phenomenon or factor into their consideration and account to judge an event or judge a fact. Henceforth they are also known as critical thinkers because whatever they express in a critical way so that the object or the event which is a knowledge for us, the object of knowledge will be glorified, the object of knowledge will be known very very clearly. Therefore they are also known as Onnigshiki. The last point I made, Nyaya philosophy as a practitioner and believer of realism seeks for acquiring knowledge of reality because they always deal with the reality. The reality means the objects, the event, the facts, those are found in the phenomenal world. Therefore Nyaya philosophy is a believer and practitioner of realism. Now we will see how this Nyaya system develops and what are the people contribute for developing this Nyaya system. Now as I said that there are not only one people involved for developing the Nyaya philosophy or the Nyaya system as such, there are many people, there are many scholars contribute in the Nyaya system for its development. First people believe that it is the Gautama who should not be confused as Gautam Buddha, Gautama just says, Gautama should not be confused as a Gautama Buddha. He said that the sage Gautama has written Nyaya Sutra or composed Nyaya Sutra. So therefore, people believe that Gautama is the founder or forefounder of the Nyaya philosophy. But the later you find that after this Nyaya Sutra developed, this is a Bhatsayana who has commented the Nyaya Sutra. Therefore, his text is known as Nyaya Bhasya. After that, Udayataka, who has written Nyaya Vartika. I repeat, after that, after Vatsayana, there is another Nyaya scholars known as Udayataka, who has written Nyaya Vartika. This is all about Nyaya, that how Nyaya developed and what are the things can be interpreted correctly. It should not be misinterpreted by others. Then after Udayataka, Vachaspati Mishra came to the existence as a Nyaya scholar, and he has written Nyaya Vartika Tatparya Tika. It is a commentary work to the Nyaya Vartika, which is written by Udayataka. So you see that how the development, how the progress happening. Then after Vachaspati Mishra, another scholars is a renowned scholar known as Udayana, who has written Nyaya Vartika Tatparya Parisuddhi, and further he has also written Kusumanjali. There are two texts you find on Nyaya. It is a classics written by Udayana. After this you find Ganges writing. Ganges as a scholar is the latest scholar who has written Tattva Chintamani, and people believe that while he developed the argument on Tattva Chintamani, he has gone beyond the argument. Initially it was developed in Nyaya Sutra by Gautama. Therefore people said that it is the Ganges who really brings to the notice of Navya Nyaya. Whatever he speaks about Nyaya, whatever opinion he has given, whatever the way he interprets Nyaya way of looking the reality is truly different from the earlier Nyaya, from the Prachina Nyaya. Therefore they said that in Nyaya philosophy we find there are two kinds of Nyaya, one is Prachina Nyaya, another is Navya Nyaya. And Ganges here is totally different in his opinion or commentary or logical argument of understanding or interpreting some of the events, facts or objects that finds in the phenomenal world. Therefore, it is believed that Ganges is the founder of Navya Nyaya, whereas Gautama is the founder of Prachina Nyaya. So in this sense, you find that there are many people really contribute to develop the Nyaya philosophy as such, and all are stick to a point that Nyaya philosophers are the practitioner of realism. They are the realist philosopher, because whatever they speak, whatever they deal with, it is all about the empirical world. It is all about the objects, facts, event and state of affairs of this empirical world. They never go beyond the empirical world. However, they try to explain things in a very particular and logical basis. Therefore, they believe in a critical study, they believe in a logical reasoning, they believe in a correct thinking. Also, they believed in a valid argument of justifying some of the facts. Henceforth, they are truly a realist philosopher in Indian philosophical content. He makes the clear distinction, as I said, that it is the Ganges or it is the text Tattva Chintamani, it is really the text which is noticed by others, saying that it is the Navya Nyaya. It is something talks about the Nyaya which is not there in earlier Nyaya. Now we will see the epistemology part, that Nyaya Epistemology. Now you have known about the Nyaya philosophy in a historical background, and also you know that how Nyaya philosophy developed and who are the people really contribute for developing the Nyaya philosophy, and how Nyaya is developed such a manner that people claim that there are two kinds of Nyaya. One is Prachina Nyaya, another is Navya Nyaya. Now we will see whatever we will discuss now, we will be discussing considering only in the Prachina Nyaya, and if at all it is necessary for a particular point or a particular issue, I will be saying that this is the Navya Nyaya or this is the opinion or commentaries made by the Navya Nyaya, but we will stick to only the Prachina Nyaya, whatever their ideas, concept about the reality. Now we will be discussing Nyaya Epistemology. as you know that epistemology deals with the theory of knowledge, how to accumulate knowledge, what is knowledge and where knowledge comes from, which part of human being really responsible for attaining a knowledge, for accumulating a knowledge, and also storing a knowledge, as a result able to recapitulate that knowledge in a later period. Now, as you find that it is really the question for the Nyaya that what is knowledge and where knowledge comes from, and if the human being is responsible himself or herself for accumulating knowledge, then where knowledge stores. So, all these issues we will be discussing in this class, in this session. Further, we will also discuss Nyaya epistemology as well as Nyaya metaphysics, so that it will be clear to you for your understanding that what is the Nyaya's contribution towards the knowledge about the worldly affairs. To have a knowledge, to identify an object means to have a knowledge about that object. Now, really the question arises, is it that knowledge or something different from that according to Nyaya philosophy? Now, we will see. The Nyaya school of thought is adhered to the atomistic pluralism and logical realism. Why they are atomistic pluralism and logical realism? Atomistic pluralism in this sense because they believe that there is not only one atom exists in this earth, there are many atoms exist, there are plurality of atoms exist in this earth, and henceforth they do not believe in the monistic approach that either God or some supernatural being or only one matter which is responsible to create the different objects in this earth. They said that it is not one atom, but there are many atoms which is really responsible element of the universe. For them there are many or plenty atoms responsible for the constituting the universe as such. Therefore, they say that we are believer of atomistic pluralism. Further, they said that they are also believer of logical realism. What they mean is that whether human being exists or not, the object exists. Whether human being perceive that object or not does not matter, but the object exists. That means the object exists independent from the human being or independent from the cognizer. We cognize an object, we identify an object, and henceforth we accumulate the knowledge about that object or we gain the knowledge of the object. Here they are saying that it is a human being who really try to attain some knowledge about that object after identifying the object. But Nyaya philosophy as such, they say that whether human being exists or not, the whole population survive or not, the object will remain as it is. The object will exist independent of human being. In this sense, they are said as logical realism. Further, they said that since we are atomistic pluralism and logical realism, we should not entertain the spiritual monism. What they mean is that there are many other schools. They believe that if you find that the whole diversified of the universe, it is not the human being is responsible for create this universe, because human being has a limited knowledge. Therefore, they always said that it is a God or supernatural being who is responsible for creating the diversified objects in this earth. Further, there are many systems that claim that it is not the God, rather there are many atoms. There are 2, 3 or 4 atoms. Few systems say that air, water, earth, fire are responsible for creating the whole universe. This statement is made by Charvaka. According to Charvaka, air, water, fire, earth, these are the responsible for creating the whole universe. However, Charvaka never include ether, because for them perception is the real knowledge. Since ether or akash cannot be perceived, therefore for them ether is not a constituent. But if you find in other school of system, they said that there are 5 atoms constituent the whole universe, or the 5 atoms in the element forms responsible for creating the different objects in this earth. These are air, water, fire, earth and ether. But here in this case of Nyaya, they never said that these are 4 or 5, They said that there are many atoms are the constituent for creating the whole universe. Further, they said that the universe, the objects of the universe exist independent of human being. Therefore, they prescribe the two connotation for them. One is logical realism and another is atomistic pluralism. So, they adhere to two principles. One is the atomistic pluralism and second one is logical realism. Atomistic pluralism because there are many atoms exist and also responsible for creating the whole universe. Logical realism because they said that the world, the phenomenon of the world, the object of the world exists independent of the human being. Though human being identify that objects or phenomena, still if human beings are not there also the objects will be exist in its own place. So, please remember there are two concepts, one is atomistic pluralism, another is logical realism expressed by the Nyaya philosophy. For the Nyaya philosophy recognizes 16 categories. Categories is known as padarthas, or padarthas in English translation is known as philosophical topics. Nyaya philosophy recognizes 16 philosophical topics. Out of 16 you find that pramana is the first one. Pramana means the source of valid knowledge, and you can also find the 16 categories, say prameya, and then you say tarka, vada, etc., etc. But now we will be focusing on the pramana, because for them the first category is known as pramana, which focuses the logical and epistemological character of the Nyaya system. It professes that there are 4 independent pramanas are known as source of valid knowledge. As I said you earlier in some other context that Nyaya philosophy really talks about the pramana. Pramana means sources of valid knowledge, and for them pramana is a category or padartha or philosophical topics for them. And they said that there are 4 sources of valid knowledge. One is perception, that you see that what are things exist in this world, then you accept its validity and henceforth you have a knowledge about that object. Secondly, they say that inference, because many things we cannot see, we have to infer the situation and your inference should be valid, and how it will be valid we will be discussing when we will be discussing inferences or anumana. Then further they said that comparison, there are many knowledge we gain by comparing from one to another. That means you compare from one object to another and hence you gain the knowledge about that object. Further they say that verbal testimony is a valid source of knowledge. That means you know who is a reliable person on which context, therefore you ask him or her opinion on a particular issue, whatever he or she will say to you, you have to accept that and you proceed accordingly, and whatever knowledge you gain from that is known as verbal testimony. The knowledge you gain through the verbal testimony. However, in all cases you find that it is the human being who gain the knowledge, who accumulate the knowledge, or who achieve the knowledge about an object or an event or a state of affairs or a phenomenon of the world. Therefore, they said that there are 4 valid sources of knowledge. One is perception, another is inference, the third one is comparison, and the fourth one is verbal testimony. Now, we will see the nature and classification of knowledge, that how Nyaya philosophy speaks or expresses about knowledge, what is their opinion about knowledge, the term knowledge within quote and unquote, and how they classify the knowledge. This system, that means the Nyaya system as such, is primarily concerned with the condition of valid thought and the means for acquiring a true knowledge of objects. What they said, what they mean is that whenever you identify an object, you should identify the object very clearly. You should know all the attributes of that objects, and also you know that the object having a particular name. and once you can have all the features of that object, even the later period also you can identify that object with that particular name. That means any knowledge you gain on a particular object, your knowledge should be so comprehensive, so clear.
It should abide by your correct thinking and also very thorough. As a result, you can claim that you have knowledge about that object. That means having knowledge of an object implies you know all the features about the object, you know the name of that object, and also you accept that whatever you know about that object, it is because of your valid thinking, your correct thinking and valid arguments. And as a result, you can claim that you know that particular object. The second point they said, a true knowledge of objects is a sure and indispensable means through which we can get the highest end of our life. That means anything that you know, any knowledge that you gain, if you know it very clearly, you can say that doing a particular thing in a correct way, this is the means to achieve the highest end. In other words, whatever you know about the objects of the world, if you know this correctly, then you will achieve the highest end in your life. They also, while identifying an object, while having a knowledge of an object, they said that there are three procedures we have to follow.
To gain a knowledge, we must have three aspects. First is psychological, second is logical, third one is philosophical. What is psychological? In psychological, we describe the fact. We describe in detail about the fact. In logical, we try to give the criticism, or we critically reflect on the description, and if we find that some criticism will be well accepted, and henceforth we try to work on that and try to re-establish the fact such a manner that we say that now whatever we are establishing or expressing about the fact or object is a valid one. And this is all about the philosophical aspect of expressing an object, philosophical aspect of judging an object. Therefore, you find that while accumulating a knowledge in the empirical world, in our day-to-day activities, we must avoid the three aspects in our life. First one is psychological, which describe about the fact. The second one is logical, which criticize the fact or taken different account into the consideration to judge the description. And the last one, if you find that there are any modification can be done for establishing that fact, you do that and try to establish that fact as it is. And this is about the philosophical. So there are three aspects involved while accumulating a knowledge of an object or event or a state of affairs of the world. Further, they say that knowledge in widest sense any means of cognizing object. That means, since they are realism or they are realistic philosopher, they say that any knowledge, if you say that you have a knowledge, that means you must understand some of the objects in this earth. You also know some of the objects in this earth very clearly with your correct thinking and valid arguments. So whenever you identify an object, you gain knowledge about that object, because all the process involved while accumulating the knowledge of that object. This is an epistemological part said by Nyaya philosophy. Continuing further, we say that, but all cognitions are not valid knowledge. That means whenever we cognize an object, we have three aspects. As I said, one is psychological, another is logical, the third one is philosophical. However, they say that with all these abiding principles or aspects, still we cannot claim that whatever knowledge we gain is a correct knowledge or valid knowledge. Why they said? Because in many times mistakenly we identify an object which is not that object. We mistakenly identify snake as a rope as an example. We mistakenly identify a rope as a snake. Still we are able to identify that object. Therefore, they said that whatever you cognize, not necessarily it resulted the valid knowledge. So for them, a valid knowledge is known as prama, or the cognition is known as buddhi. It is our, because of rationality and reason and intelligence, we cognize the object. We cognize the object as it is we identify the features about the object, the essence and accidental qualities of the object. Therefore, they said that though it is the buddhi, through buddhi we identify an object, however, all the knowledge are not valid knowledge. Therefore, they say that invalid knowledge is known as aprama and valid knowledge is known as prama. Now, in order to explain the knowledge, for them knowledge can be said as jnana. In Sanskrit, knowledge is termed as jnana. In order to explain the term knowledge, Nyaya took two perspectives. One is epistemological, another is metaphysical. Now, we will see what they mean by epistemological and how they treat knowledge under the epistemological purview or under the epistemological context, how they treat the term knowledge and what are their discussion on knowledge under metaphysical grounds. Now, first we will see how they treat knowledge in epistemological ground. For them, knowledge or cognition is the revelation or manifestation of objects. That means, whenever we have knowledge, we know about that object clearly. Therefore, they said that revelation of objects, manifestation of objects. If you have a knowledge about the object, say chair, at any time if I say chair, you can able to identify that object as chair. You can able to describe about that object as chair. Therefore, they said that any knowledge we have, we must able to describe about that object, we must able to identify that object in later period by cognizing all its features. Therefore, in a wider sense, knowledge means the revelation or manifestation of that object. Further, they said knowledge or jnana is the apprehension, is upalabdhi, apprehension is known as upalabdhi, or consciousness is anubhava or awareness of objects. What they mean is that the knowledge, having knowledge of an object, we must have apprehension, upalabdhi of that object. That means we realize that there is an object. It is not enough just identifying that object, because whenever you identify, you should also be alert about that object. You should be consciously identify that object. Then only whatever cognition you have, it will be a valid cognition or prama. Otherwise, there are many times we identify object, but we could not able to recapitulate it further. That means our identification is not correct. We never realize that object. That is, they said that upalabdhi, we should realize about that object. That is apprehension of that object. You must apprehend that object with consciously and also with awareness. That means you should be alert while identifying an object. You also realize about that object by identifying all its features. And if you do that, the first one is apprehension, second one is consciousness, third one is awareness. If these three things are there for identifying an object, you can claim that you have a knowledge about that object, because you have apprehend that object. That means you realize the object. The second one, you are conscious while identifying that object, and also you are alert intentionally, you are cognizing that object. Therefore, your knowledge will be a valid knowledge. This is an epistemological way of looking knowledge by Nyaya philosophy. Further, they said knowledge reveals or manifests all objects just as the light of a lamp reveals all physical objects. That means if you find that there is a light, by the help of light you can see the nearby objects. If the lamp you will burn, you find that in the dark room, if you burn the lamp, you find that you can able to see some of the objects. In the same way, it is the knowledge which reveals all the objects that you find in the empirical world. This is the epistemological way, this is the epistemological ground on which Nyaya philosophy argues that like a lamp reveals the objects which are found nearby, in the same way knowledge reveals the objects that you find in this phenomenal world. Second point, they said object of apprehension or upalabdhi may be a thing, may be a quality, an act, an emotion, both existent and non-existent entity in this earth. What they mean that? It is not necessary, or it is not always the case that whenever we identify an object. Whenever we have a knowledge, it is always about the object. Objects means that find in the phenomenal world. They said that there are many kind of objects, like in the form of action, in the form of thing. Thing means object, in the thing of quality, in the thing of desire, can be a knowledge. If I say that I have a desire to write on paper, here desire is a knowledge. If I say that these two people are arguing on a certain fact, here argument, they are doing on some actions, it can be a knowledge. You throw a stone, the action that you do can be a knowledge. Therefore, they said that object of apprehension, the upalabdhi of that object may be a thing. You can realize a object also, you can realize a quality of an object, you can also realize an activity initiated for an object, and also you can know the desire for doing an action towards an object. So, all these cases, what Nyāya's claim is that anything that you do, any knowledge that you gain, it should relate to an object, it corresponds to an object. So, therefore, they said that knowledge is not limited to the particular object or 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5 objects. Your knowledge can be related to a thing, and your knowledge can be related to a desire, a knowledge related to a both existent and non-existent entity of this earth. So, now they brought on the scope, saying that it is not that whenever you identify an object you gain the knowledge, but also there are many knowledge you gain without identifying that object. Therefore, they said that desire can be a knowledge, anxiety can be a knowledge, emotion can be a knowledge. Now, but in all cases, by saying so, they said that, but in all cases knowledge means there must be something that stands out as the object of knowledge. Anything you have a knowledge, there must be something relates to that knowledge known as object of that knowledge. For example, if I say that this is a chair, now the object of knowledge is that it is a solid object, chair is a solid object, and the purpose, sitting purpose, etc., etc. So, there is an object referring to that object. Suppose if I say that I have a knowledge of desire, desire of whom is an animal or an individual. So, therefore, I say that whenever you say knowledge, it should relate to an object, it should stand for an object. Therefore, they say knowledge means there must be something that stands out as the object of knowledge. Thus, knowledge consists simply in the manifestation of objects. In any of the cases, whenever you have a knowledge, there must be an object related to that. Any knowledge you have, you say that this knowledge stands out for the object. Now, we will see in details what they said further. Without knowledge, we lose the ground of all rational practice and intelligent activity. That is clear to all of you, because without knowledge, we cannot have a rational practice, we cannot judge a particular issue with our rational ability, even we cannot able to think something intelligently, because you think intelligent means your thought should be a correct one, your argument should be valid. Therefore, knowledge is an indispensable element for judging an issue correctly and also arguing on some issue very valid way. On the basis of knowledge, living beings deal with other objects of the phenomenal world. He said that different human being or each human being have a different knowledge for different objects, because they behave towards that object differently. It is not the case that each and every human being, whatever knowledge they have, they all gain the knowledge through the same source of means. It is not the case. Let us say X is a person gain the knowledge of that fire and smoke through the inference relation, but somebody may be gain this kind of knowledge through the perception. Therefore, they are saying that it is a different people gain the knowledge through different sources of knowledge, therefore, they behave towards the different objects differently. And once the people behave towards the object differently, then its a knowledge can be considered as a behavior of an animal or behavior of a human being. They said that knowledge may be called as the behavior or conduct of living beings, because once you have accumulated the knowledge of different objects, then you know that different objects meant for different purposes. Therefore, you use that objects differently. Henceforth, your behavior towards that object certainly it is different from one to another. Your behavior towards the water bottle may not be same as your behavior towards a pet animal. Your behavior towards your dot pen is not certainly the behavior towards your computer. Therefore, they say that different people behave differently because they accumulate the knowledge of different objects differently. In this sense, knowledge will be treated as the behavior or conduct of living beings. Knowledge of myself. Question arises, we can have a knowledge of objects which is found in this world, but how can we have a knowledge of ourselves? How can we claim that I have a knowledge of myself? Here Nyaya said that it is because of the introspection of myself. Self is in quote and unquote. Self which is an eternal, which is found in the body, through which we are able to open our eye, through which we are able to express our ideas, through which we are able to utter some words, through which we are able to move from one place to another, through which we are able to reproduce many more things. It is because of the soul we can able to do that. It is because of the soul we desire for something, we have emotion for something, so on and so forth. Therefore, they are saying that to have a knowledge of myself, one should also realize or have a upalabdhi or have a apprehension about his or her self. Self here is quote and unquote. Once somebody have a realization or upalabdhi of the self or soul, can also have a knowledge of that myself. I repeat, I say that once somebody should realize his or her self, self is in quote and unquote, can also have a knowledge of myself. Therefore, whenever you say that myself, it stands out for the object known as self. This is the explanation given by Nyaya philosophers. Further, they said that knowledge of myself as an introspection of myself can be distinguished from my intellect, volitions, desires and affections. What they mean is that knowledge can be distinguished from feelings, volition and desire, but cannot be separable. Because whenever you have a knowledge of yourself, you must have a desire for that. That means your mind is there and your soul is there. Your mind, soul, body, sense organs and the object. These four things connect together or relate together. As a result, you have some kind of knowledge about that object. What are these things? Your mind, your soul, your sense organs and body and the object. These are the things which are responsible for having a new idea or for having an idea of a particular object, event or state of affairs of the world. Therefore, they say that whenever I have a knowledge of myself, I can also think of that I know something, I have a desire something, I have anxiety and I have emotion. All these are subtle elements, is a concepts. This emotion is a concept. Therefore, they are saying that whenever you have a knowledge of myself, you cannot separate from yourself saying that myself has nothing to do with emotion, myself has nothing to do with desire, anxiety, so on and so forth. They say that once you have a self means you have all these things. However, the self is not same as all these volition, desire, affection. What they are saying is that the self can be distinguished from volition, desire, affection, feelings. However, it cannot be separated from volitions, desire, etc., etc., because the concept soul has to be understood by the help of the other concepts, like that you know something, you have a desire for something, you have anxiety for something and you are emotionally attached with something. Okay? So, in this context they said that those self can be distinguished from all these features of a human being, but cannot be separated from all these concepts like emotion and desires. Thus, they claim that I am knowing, I as a self, I am knowing means I am desiring or willing or doing something or simply being pleased or displeased with the objects or with it. Whenever you say I am knowing, I as a self, it implies that your self is desiring, willing or try to do something or simply being pleased or displeased with some of the objects. Therefore, you can have a realize of self, that is I within quote and unquote. Thus, knowledge is a cognitive fact by which we have an apprehension or upalabdhi or understanding of objects. Thus, what they said is that they conclude on an epistemological ground by treating knowledge by saying that whenever you have a knowledge of objects, that is your anupalabdhi, that means you realize that object, you can understand that object by identifying or diagnosing all its features. If you can do that, you can claim that you now able to cognize that object. You say that I have a cognition and you cognize that object. The cognition, whenever you cognize that object, there are two things involved. One is subject, another is object. Object has to be cognized and the cognizer is a human being, has to cognize that object. So that means from one side you find there is a cognizer, another side you find there is a cognition, and you find there is a process where the cognizer is able to cognize that object. And the process, if it comes under the four process as said by Nyaya philosophy, perception, inference, comparison, testimony, then the cognition, the knowledge of cognition will be a valid one. This is the epistemological way of arguing what knowledge is according to Nyaya philosophy. Now we see the metaphysical grounds on which Nyaya philosophy argues. The first three questions is very important for a metaphysical perspective. If at all they are judging knowledge under the metaphysical perspective, then Nyaya philosophy are answerable to the three questions. The first one is that, is the knowledge a mode or an activity? The second one, is it a relation or something other than relation? Further they said that, is the knowledge a substance or an attribute? These three questions are very pertinent or important while explaining the term knowledge under the metaphysical perspectives. And Nyaya philosophy explain or try to attempt these three questions and able to explain that how knowledge can be considered or treated under these three dimensions, that is whether knowledge is a relation or something other than relation, whether knowledge is an activity or is it a mode. The lastly they say that whether knowledge is a substance or knowledge is an attribute. So all these things we will be discussing in the next class. In the next class also we will be saying that, we will be explaining that how Nyayakas really consider the knowledge or concept jnana, it is a Sanskrit term jnana which is an English translation of knowledge, how they explain the jnana under the metaphysical perspectives. And this will help you to understand Nyayaka's standpoint, on the one hand epistemological ground and the other hand metaphysical ground on the term knowledge. You can able to understand what Nyaya is explaining on knowledge, first under the metaphysical ground and the second is an epistemological ground, so that you can have a comprehensive knowledge about the term knowledge or jnana as suggested by Nyaya philosophy. Thank you.